and welcome to the Growth Lab's Development Talk Seminar. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Herman Frasheri, and I'll be moderating this session. A few words about the seminar. The Growth Lab's Development Talks is a series of conversations with policymakers and academics working in international development. The seminar provides a platform for practitioners and researchers to discuss both the practice of development and analytical work centered on policy reforms. In today's seminar, we are thrilled to welcome Kanye Heineke, First Assistant Secretary at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who will discuss Australian experience in providing foreign aid, and particularly in creating the space to stimulate and accommodate labor mobility. Daniel will be talking about temporary labor mobility programs, their purpose, design, and implementation. We are honored to have you here with us today, Daniel. Welcome. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to mention two things. If you want to stay up to date with the Growth Lab's research, events, and job opportunities, you can visit our website, follow us on social media, and sign up for our quarterly newsletter. More information can also be found at growthlab.cid.harvard.edu. And also, secondly, please stay tuned for details on our next Development Talk seminar. This will be announced later on this month. And now, without no further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Kanye Heineke is the First Assistant Secretary, Labor and Connectivity Division, within the Office of the Pacific, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Daniel has over 2 decades of experience in government, in leading policy and program delivery in the Indo-Pacific region, and with 9 years of overseas work in Timor-Leste, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea. Daniel previously worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers and holds a Bachelor of Commerce and Masters in International Relations and Economics. Daniel oversees the design of Australia's temporary labor mobility scheme with the Pacific Islands and, more recently, Southeast Asian countries. These programs enable employers in Australia to recruit low and semi-skilled workers to work for 1 to 3 years in rural and regional Australia. The industries in which workers are placed include agriculture, meat processing, fisheries and forestry, hospitality, and elderly care. We are very excited to discuss the design and implementation of these schemes with Daniel today. Labor mobility is of significant relevance to our work, given its impact on improving the livelihood of workers, their countries, as well as enabling employers to access needed skills for their operations. So the format for today's event will be the following. I'll pose a series of questions to Daniel, and then after that discussion, we'll open up to questions from the audience. If you have a question that you would like to ask, please type it in the Zoom Q&A box. And also, please include your full name and affiliation. So, Daniel, the first question that I would like to ask is about labor mobility as a strategy for economic development. So, and more particularly, the Pacific Labor Scheme, PLS, originated as an Australian foreign policy priority to engage with the Pacific with greater intensity and ambition. It is an innovative policy that recognizes constraints to growth in the Pacific and provides economic opportunity to strengthen the region. But labor mobility is also a rare foreign policy tool. We do not see many advanced countries pursuing it. So why did Australia adopt this specific policy? That is to say, what did you hope to achieve? And why do you think labor mobility is the way to achieve your goal? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to those of you that are joining us in the Southern Hemisphere. I'm Danielle, and thank you for having me today. I first of all just wanted to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional owners of the land in Canberra here in Australia, in which we sit past, present and emerging leaders. So thank you for the question, and just thank you to everyone for your ears today, and I'm very keen to get your follow-up questions as well. So I've been working in labour mobility now for about 2.5 years in the Office of the Pacific, and as Emil indicated, recently Australia has announced an agriculture visa, which is also being designed and implemented by my team. So I'll first talk about the Pacific, which is the primary focus of what we do at the moment. Really important to acknowledge that labour mobility with the Pacific has a dual foreign policy development, but also a domestic policy objective. We often describe it as a win-win. It's a win for foreign policy and development because it's in the interests of the sending countries, and a really popular piece of the Step Up. And from a domestic perspective, it's a win because it provides much needed labour, particularly in the agriculture sector, but as indicated by Emil, we're increasingly growing into other sectors. So first of all, to talk about the foreign policy and development objectives. We have a Pacific Step Up, and this has three pillars. We see labour mobility, which provides jobs and economic opportunities for Pacific Islanders as an important centrepiece of the Pacific Step Up. It aims to advance development, security in our region, the Indo-Pacific, with the special focus on our neighbours in the Pacific and Timor-Leste, through greater security, economic and people-to-people integration. It recognises that there are limited opportunities for jobs in many Pacific countries and in Timor-Leste, and that remittances and the skills and experience that bring through labour mobility is really important to Pacific countries' development. It was also designed in the context of a PACER Plus trade agreement, which had a very strong development objective. Over time, as we announced further policies on our Step Up, the PACER Plus objectives are still there, but it wasn't just limited to PACER Plus countries. So just to acknowledge that it did originally have an important labour mobility aspect linked to our trade agreement with the Pacific that New Zealand is also part of. Secondly, like all developed countries, we need labour, particularly in agriculture, hospitality, tourism, and into the future, we really see the huge growth is in the care sectors, disability, aged care. Our Agricultural Bureau of Economics in Australia has also found that Pacific workers are 3 times as productive as backpackers. Traditionally, Australia has relied very heavily on working holiday makers, otherwise known as backpackers. Normally, we would have something like 160,000 in Australia, and their second and third year extensions are linked to working in the agriculture sector. For the second year, it's linked to 88 days, and for the third year, it's linked to 6 months. So, but what we've found over time is that the success of the Pacific Labour Scheme, the Pacific Labour Mobility Scheme through the Seasonal Workers Program, which I'll get into in a minute, is more productive because they tend to return every year, they become skilled in what they do, and they tend to stay for the duration of their visa, as opposed to backpackers who are unsponsored and they can move as they need to. So basically, I just want to go into, first of all, the Seasonal Workers Program. So the Seasonal Workers Program actually started in 2008. It was a pilot program. It grew really slowly. It started at 50 workers and it grew over time. It was a pilot, and it was very much there to test to see how this sponsored visa might work. I think you've probably read in the press that there's been quite a lot of criticism and exploitation in the working holiday makers market, and that's partly because it's been an unregulated, unsponsored visa. So it very much relies on the domestic instruments that we have through our Australian Border Force, through our Fair Work Ombudsman that monitors pay, etc., to basically ensure that those types of workers who feel like they might be exploited actually do cry out and seek help. But that, as we all know, for those working in the migration space, not everybody seeks help. So what part of the design around the Seasonal Workers Program and now around the Pacific Labour Scheme is that it's regulated. And we actually, as a government, put quite a lot of money into the compliance and assurance processes for these schemes, which started with the Seasonal Workers Program, and now that's been built into the Pacific Labour Scheme. Really important to note that the growth that we've had from the Seasonal Workers Scheme on average has been, in the last few years, 40%. So in 18-19, which is our last year before the pandemic commenced, we had around 12,000 workers in Australia during that financial year. Of course, that's seasonal, so not all of them were in Australia at any point in time. Important also to note that this scheme is operated by our employment department, and its primary objective was really filling jobs. In many ways, the foreign policy objectives was a secondary objective at that point in time. So the PLS, the Pacific Labour Scheme, came into being in 2018. It was many years in the making. Lots of people were advocating for Pacific labour as being a really important part of our foreign policy and development objectives in the Pacific. There was a World Bank study, for example, called Pacific Futures that really looked at what the future of the economic development of the Pacific is. And there was two real highlights to that. One of them was really tourism, which of course has proven to be very difficult as a resilient strategy now with the pandemic that nobody really anticipated. And the other one was labour mobility. So really important as part of the development in the perspective in terms of how we've designed the Pacific Labour Scheme. And important to note that in all our development programs in Australia, we don't develop a log frame and then look at it and set and forget it for 4 years. It's very much an adaptive program and policy that we're developing and implement. So as I mentioned before, the Pacific Labour Scheme was different to the seasonal worker program, and it came with higher ambition from a development and integration perspective. What's really important to many Pacific countries is circular mobility. So the way that we've designed the Pacific Labour Scheme is, although the primary demand is in the low-skilled sector, in agriculture and meatworks, there's very much, because of the 1 to 3 year visa, an encouragement for on skills. And we have a small, but importantly, it will grow as we learn. We're linking much more to a 5-tiered skill framework, which will allow people in Australia to upskill, particularly linked to trades and our TAFE system here in Australia. So an example of that would be if you're working in horticulture, for those that are sponsored to move up the food chain, we would look at doing certificate 3 and 4 that allows them to move into high skilled, but also to be recognised for their qualification. Also really important that people go back to the Pacific with qualifications. Not all the sectors that Pacific workers are working in here in Australia actually are industries in Pacific countries. So meatworks in many countries is very small. It's not a significant export sector. So it's really about the application of the skills and in many ways the work ethic and the professionalism of what they're gaining here in Australia that we hope to bring back to the Pacific. As I mentioned, it's 3 years and there's a requirement to go back for 6 months before people can come again. That was quite important to the Pacific, and the Pacific all had quite different views about how long that offshore period should be. Some wanted it to be much longer and others wanted it to be shorter because they didn't want to see it as a circular mobility program. They wanted to see it as an employment program because of that huge unemployment gap in many Pacific countries. So that's really my first point, is that we do have that really strong objective to get circular mobility. The other way that we hope to contribute to the Pacific development through this program is obviously an investment that people bring back. And one of the future questions is about remittances, so I won't go into all the detail there. But there are, what we're trying to do is to link it to our development programs in many of the countries. So when people go back in country, there is a way of thinking about how they might invest in their own communities or in businesses that they start up through the skills that they've learned here. So that is an objective. I have to be honest and say that it's not something that happens for every worker. Many workers, and I'll go into the remittance data in a second, really what they're after is educating their children, improving their dwellings, those kinds of objectives, which I think are probably pretty common objectives across labour mobility schemes globally. Thirdly, one of the objectives is really to try and move more of the Pacific Labour Scheme into what we call in Australia and New Zealand as ANSCO Skills Level 3. So that's very much the semi-skilled market, and really the key sectors where we see demand for that skill level is really in the care sectors and over time in the tourism hospitality sectors as people start to move up into some of those supervision type functions. So what we are trying to do is, where possible, link it to education opportunities before they go, to allow people to get into those sectors. Increasingly, what we're finding, and we're doing this through an aid program that we have that has been going for many years across the Pacific, called the Australian Pacific Technical Coalition, which focuses on tech voc, both for skills in Pacific countries to meet their labour demand, but also to help people access opportunities for labour mobility. So one of the areas that we're really, really focused on there is aged care, to give people opportunities in Australia. But what we're finding over time is, because the aged care Australian qualifications for that require on-the-job training with supervision, Pacific countries typically don't have a lot of aged care facilities. As you're probably aware, many people are looked after in the home by their traditional families. So there's only a few, and they tend to be in Fiji. So what we're looking at now is trying to do much more of that training in Australia, where they might come out as unskilled, access opportunities. And we're piloting these schemes now with various Australian states to then move into aged care through achieving their training in Australia, because we think that's going to help us get to scale in some of those sectors. So that's really important as a policy objective as well. As was mentioned earlier, the Pacific Labour Scheme is a temporary visa. It's not a permanent residence pathway. There has been recently quite a lot of discussion about permanent residence pathways, and that's because the new agricultural visa has talked about permanent residence pathway. I think that the key word there really is pathway. We're very conscious of not contributing to brain drain in the Pacific. So in many ways, if we end up designing that kind of pathway for the Pacific, and there is mixed views on that, what we'll be trying to do is make sure that we don't contribute to brain drain. So as an example, Kiribati is a country that has high population growth, limited land use. They are very interested in this type of pathway as a migration strategy and as a remittance strategy and as a sort of diaspora population strategy. And the reason for that is that the gap between school leavers and employment opportunities is high. They're an economy that does traditionally rely on seafarers for remittances. So those kinds of countries are very interested. So I think what's going to be really important if we end up designing those pathways, and that's important to note that there isn't yet an Australian government policy on that, something we're working on at the moment. These things, as I will get onto later, are very political, as I'm sure you all know. So we're trying to design it in a way that it really will target, in many ways, the unskilled. So we're not contributing to brain drain. But as Farah and others know very well, when you have a wage disparity, it can at times attract people into labour mobility that we don't want to take out of the economy, because they're valuable nurses, doctors, others that are very much attracted to those kind of pathways for other reasons. I just want to get briefly onto COVID, because the COVID pandemic has had a really big impact, and it's been a real disruptor here in Australia in terms of labour mobility. In many ways, COVID has been a win for Pacific Labour. Many of you may be aware by watching Australian media, we've had a very conservative approach to COVID. We've closed our borders. Only Australians are allowed to enter. There is a Biodiversity Act which means Australians cannot exit unless they've got a good reason to do so, which is fairly closely monitored. So when we shut our borders in March 2020, we also had to stop our labour mobility programs, and basically all migration to Australia stopped, temporary, permanent. There was a large number of visa holders that could not come to Australia because there wasn't quarantine space. The policy was very much about prioritising returning Australians who lived overseas that needed to get back. And the real constraint there was our states and territories control health. And that meant that because they controlled health, they controlled quarantine. And there was restrictions and caps on the number of Australians that were able to come back into Australia. So what we were able to do when we shut our borders, and this gets to the heart of the foreign policy goals as well, we were able to go through our various government processes and our process that the Commonwealth has with states and territories that we call National Cabinet. And we were able to basically argue for foreign policy reasons, for Pacific family reasons, for economic reasons, both here and Pacific, that we need to bring this cohort in. Also, as many Pacific islands are islands, at that point in time, we didn't have community transmission in the Pacific. We did have some in Papua New Guinea at the time. And so there was different risk appetites applied to different countries. But basically, because of their COVID-free status, we were able to get agreement from all of our states and territories, except one, the one I sit in, the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, that doesn't really have a high demand for agriculture workers. We were able to get agreement to bring them in, and they were coming in above quarantine caps because they were perceived as low risk because they didn't have community transmission in Pacific countries. So what that has done is it's effectively moved from 2018, there was 9,000 workers in Australia at any point in time from the Pacific. So not over the course of the year. FTE in Australia at that point in time was 9,000. We now have something like 15,500. So we've doubled. And our Prime Minister recently at our Pacific Island Forum announced a doubling from August until March next year. And the reason for that, as I said, it's not just been the foreign policy goals. It's very much also been that it's been the only economic cohort, apart from a few Hollywood actors that have been able to get in, that have been able to come in that meet the risk appetite of our states and territories. So we have been able to really gain market share as backpackers have exited as a critical labour supply. So we are aiming to get to around 24,000 Pacific workers across both schemes. Majority is still in the seasonal workers program. We have about nearly 5,000 now in the Pacific Labour Scheme from a startup of 1,000 in the first year of operations in 18-19. So demand is high. And I think the other reason that employers go for it is it does allow them to essentially say we meet the standards of the PLS and the SWP, which is important in some sectors to tick various accreditation boxes. So I will leave that there in terms of my first question and pass it back to you, Emil.
Thanks so much, Daniela, for this very comprehensive overview of the system, of the policies and the programs that you initiated and implemented, the distributional effects of those, the next steps, as well as the way how you handle the situation imposed by COVID-19. So it's very much appreciated. I have two particular questions that I like to ask, which in a way address the same thing, but from two different ends. Right? So when we think about labor mobility, we have in mind two particular constituencies, which are important, and especially when it comes to a policy-making terrain that you navigate so well. So on the one hand, we have your counterparts, right? Other government officials in these sending countries in the Pacific. And on the other hand, we have employers, but also more specifically, association of professionals, right? Or other constituencies in Australia. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about whether you can discuss how did your counterparts in sending countries receive this initiative? So what were their signals to you? How do they engage with you? And the second is, how did professional groups and associations, businesses in Australia receive or view the initiative? So what was their feedback? You elaborated on the distributional effects of migrant workers, the way how they relate to their countries of origin, and the focus that you have in order to ensure that there is a way for the migrant workers to give back. But I was curious whether you could elaborate a little bit more on the way, again, to recap the question, the way how counterparts in various countries involved saw this initiative, and also secondly, how did you deal with the home-based constituencies? Right?
Sure. Okay. Thank you for the question. I think it's fair to say not just at the official level, but including at the political level. So any prime minister to prime minister dialogue, any foreign minister to foreign minister, trade minister to trade minister across our countries, Pacific labour is highly valued, and it is pretty much always one of the topics that is discussed. There is, in many countries, particularly those who do not have a large footprint, so Papua New Guinea would be an example of that, a high desire to really increase their participation in the scheme. So I think that's the first point, is it's really at the forefront of what the Pacific would like from Australia. And from our perspective, we really see it is one of our really important, as I mentioned before, foreign policy and development goals, because what we can offer in this space, many others can't, which is access to employment, jobs and economic opportunities. So it is important as well from a people-to-people perspective. We really think, in terms of the Pacific Step Up, that those people-to-people links that develop between Australia, New Zealand and the Pacific are really important going forward, because it provides a cultural understanding of each other as our Pacific family. It's really important as well to say, and this has very much come under our recent Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who has been at the forefront of Pacific Step Up, is he's had a long history with Fiji in particular, through his church links with the Pacific, and has been going back there for decades. And the concept of Pacific family is really important in Pacific culture. Pacific family means, particularly Melanesian culture, that you have a reciprocity, and what you do for family goes beyond what you do for others. So that is really important. It's a win-win, not just with our domestic stakeholders, but it's a win-win as well with the Pacific. They're important to us and we're important to them. And that relationship, and then how you solve problems in that cultural aspect, is really important. But first of all, I wanted to go into some of the more tangible aspects of why counterparts in sending countries like these schemes. And I will get onto, I guess, some of the challenges that we have as well. And many of those sit in the welfare space. So I will get onto that at the end. First, remittances and jobs. Clearly very important. Many countries, you're probably aware, public servants pay just as a benchmark. You know, they might only be earning $500 US a month, and that is for a reasonably senior public servant in some countries. So if you look at the average Pacific worker, our minimum pay rate here in Australia is $19.84, and that's currently being reviewed by the Fair Work Commission at the moment. It is looking into piece rates and minimum wages, and we expect probably that there'll be changes to that over the next period, which will probably increase wages, certainly in the agriculture sector. So that's really important. But the average Pacific worker in the seasonal worker program, and this is a World Bank estimate, does remit something like $1,061 a month. It's particularly important in some countries. Remittances are more important than others. In the Pacific Labour Scheme, the remittances are slightly higher. It's they've either remitted or saved $1,244. During COVID, we have been looking at that to see what the impact is, and it does vary. It's very hard to get data because during COVID, you can only get data from some of the payment systems. And traditionally, many workers who were coming back and forth, particularly in the seasonal space, did take cash home. So it's very difficult to capture what the cash impact of COVID has been. The anecdotal evidence that's come back, we've done surveys from workers, is that they have remitted less during COVID in this scheme than they have before. And the reason for that has partly been lockdowns in Australia between states has created uncertainty, and sometimes that's meant that they've had higher variability in the wages that they've earned. Also, just I guess just that link of not going home as much has also had an impact as well. I will let you know, though, in 2020, when we did look at the data that was coming on remittances through the official payment system, is we did find that to Pacific that in many countries remittances actually increased, and we think, and we don't have hard evidence for that, is that a lot of the stimulus payments that we had here in Australia and New Zealand had similar schemes, and I'm sure in other countries like the US that are important as well to some Pacific countries, those stimulus measures actually had an impact on remittances. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the countries and also the top remittance expenditures that we've been able to get from workers' preferences. So the top 4 remittance expenditures that have been important to communities in the Pacific, the top one has been food and consumption, education, then dwellings improvement, and then health. So they're the top 4 typically for what remittances get spent on. We're also looking at, from a development perspective, who makes those decisions. Is it the remittancer? Is it the woman in the household? So we are looking at those gender impacts as well over time as we get further into the scheme. But I want to really point out that it really varies by country in terms of the impact that these schemes have had. And that depends on, obviously, the size of the population that's here. In Polynesian countries, it's much higher. And in Melanesian countries, it's much lower. So, for example, in Tonga, remittances make up about 40% of their GDP. Most of this is actually coming from permanent migration, not necessarily from temporary migrants. But of course, there's a pathway there. And of course, temporary migration is still important. At the moment, Australia and New Zealand schemes make up about 14.7% of jobs for Tongans that are actually still Tongan citizens. That are on temporary schemes. And during 2021, remittances were up 32%, and we assessed that it was quite important to preventing an economic crisis in the Pacific. By comparison, PNG is only 0.1% remittances. So in PNG and other Melanesian countries, less important. Our policy objective is, of course, to make it more important to those countries. Another example is Vanuatu. There are around 5,000 workers from Vanuatu. It's been the highest country under the seasonal worker program for a long period of time. And if we assume that one worker has some kind of impact on 10 family members, because of course they're fairly large family groups as beneficiaries, this actually equates to around 1/6 of Vanuatu's population that benefits indirectly. So we, again, over time are looking at not only the impact it's having economically, but also the impact over time. We're looking at what impact that does have on the political development of Vanuatu. Traditionally, in Melanesian countries, they're very dependent on government and their own MP for development opportunities. But as more money is going into the outer islands in Vanuatu from these types of labour mobility schemes with Australia and New Zealand, it is changing over time, the political economies of those countries. So that is something that we're looking at over the longer term as well. I think I've covered remittances generally. I think you're all probably aware from your global research that generally remittances have been down. We haven't necessarily found that in all Pacific countries. Fiji's also had higher remittances as well. And we think it's a combination of that large offshore diaspora who have benefited from payments. But I want to also highlight that it was very much a consideration for Australia, not only in the opening border process, but what we also did at the beginning of the pandemic is any seasonal worker or Pacific Labour Scheme worker that was here in Australia, and many were also cut, particularly in the tourism hospitality sectors, they lost their jobs, just like Australians did when borders shut. So what we did was we created a new visa. We call it the 408, and it was a pandemic visa. And what that allowed us to do was to move workers that originally only had a 9 to 12 month visa. It allowed us to move them around Australia. So many of the workers, I think we've done something like 12,500 movements of workers across employers in Australia to allow them to stay here, both for their own economic benefit, but also for ours. We need workers who are here in Australia. So that was really important as well. Secondly, beyond that, in terms of what officials like about the scheme, and I've talked about this before, is people, there's two things they're really looking for. They're really looking for people moving up the ranks. So they're not in the low skilled sector, they're moving up into those, what we call ANZOG 3 levels, linked to qualifications, but also that people are returning, and that some of those integration strategies that we've got are really trying to ensure that people invest in businesses on return. So that's really a kind of long-term development objective. In terms of Australian audiences, businesses, professional organisations, the general public, what's the feeling about Pacific Labour? I think firstly from the Australian public, really, I think, again, getting back to that family concept and our region, people really value the role that Pacific Islanders play. During the pandemic in particular, there's been a lot of really positive media, some of it which we put out there, but others which has been really picked up from the press, that really highlights the importance that is played to the Pacific for some of the work that they're doing here. In many countries, Australians aren't moving to do this work for a whole range of reasons. And so there is a high appreciation for what the Pacific do for that scheme. One example, there's been a couple of examples where the media, and in some cases it's gone viral actually, where Pacific Islanders have been singing from their balcony or singing from their release from quarantine. There was a group of Fijians that were featured singing from a hotel balcony in Hobart, and then another group that were released from Samoa. And those kind of images, which was a song to Australia to thank them for having them and welcoming them to Australia, has really gone viral, and it's really kind of capturing that cultural appreciation. There are, as I said before, I guess there are different views in the agriculture sector. Those that are using Pacific Labour, and we have about 200 employers, and many of those are labour hire, so they actually work across many sectors, and many small employers access labour hire to be able to enter the scheme. So people really value the Pacific Labour because it provides a stable workforce for them. They're able to train them, as I said before, but also they get productivity out of them, which they don't tend to get out of backpackers. So it enables them to make predictable planting decisions that they may not be able to do without predictable labour supply. It is seen from a kind of fair work perspective as the gold standard, because as I mentioned before, there is quite a lot of compliance and assurance over that. Now that works very well for the high end of town, the bigger players, those that have got human resource capability and others. But for small players, one of the critiques that we get is the access standards and the compliance and others are just too high for small players. We, for example, don't let people sign on to schemes if they don't have solvency checks. If they've got a poor record with the Fair Work Ombudsman, they won't be able to enter the scheme. And labour hire will look at those types of issues too, because of course it will affect their reputation if some of their downstream users of labour become a media case because of poor treatment of workers. So that is something that's an ongoing challenge all the time, is really getting that welfare balance right with the red tape, compliance and assurance. And that is an ongoing process that is one of the areas that we're always evolving. Finally, one thing that you always get as well, and it varies from employers, many of the employers actually really like the cultural connection with their workers. And some of the stories that we get back from employers is they like that the remittances that they're helping workers earn actually go back to their home communities and contribute to development in their own communities. So it is really important. When I remember meeting with the Prime Minister from PNG at one point, and he was talking about how when he was when he worked on the farms back in 19, I think it was in the 1980s, he was earning 19 cents an hour. The fact that people are earning almost $20 an hour, and it is varied in different sectors. We have different minimum wages for different sectors. That sort of disparity in wages, I think, is really important. So for us, probably the hardest challenge that we've got in moving this forward is just making sure really that the domestic apparatus that we have, and we do have a whole of government migrant worker task force and other types of reforms going on, if those domestic reforms are resourced to make sure that they're actually then being implemented in terms of policy. So one of the other areas that is a real challenge, we actually at the moment link accommodation. So employers have to have suitable accommodation, they have to provide it, they have to make sure that it meets certain standards, bathroom access per worker, etc., etc. That is really difficult in rural Australia at the moment. There is a shortage and there's a lack of private sector investment. So there's a whole lot of kind of flow on domestic settings that really do impact on the welfare and the ability to supply labour that we have to tackle from a policy perspective, not just at the federal level. A lot of the things that we have to do are actually at the state and local level and requires that cooperation between three levels of government. So I will end it there, and again, very happy to answer questions at the end if there's more that comes up from that.
Yeah, thanks so much again for both explaining the way how you engage with your counterparts and the way how they saw the programs. But also, it's very heartening to see the reaction from Australian audiences and the general public. And my next question has to do more exactly with how do you build that goodwill, or how do you build a program out of that goodwill, right? So Growth Lab is housed at the Harvard Kennedy School of Public Policy School, and we are very much interested in the mechanics of public policy making, right? So my next question was more about the administrative side of things, and more particular, how do you administer a labor mobility program, right? So from the moment your department decided to pursue labor mobility as a policy to engage with the Pacific, what were the steps needed to build a temporary labor mobility scheme, like the PLS, for instance? Who had to be involved? How did you navigate the policymaking terrain to make that happen?
Okay, well, thank you. So the first challenge, and I've mentioned this before, was the policy barrier. We really did rely in building the PLS. We did very much rely on the relative success of the seasonal workers program. The seasonal workers program was restricted only to seasonal agriculture, and what we were really arguing for is that in order to meet our foreign policy goals and some of the aspirations of the Pacific from a development perspective, as well as from a integration with Australian sort of labour market and people-to-people perspective, we really needed to expand the opportunities for Pacific labour. So I think the first point is it does need to be built on a solid analysis of demand in Australia and workforce gaps. So you can't do that as a foreign policy ministry. Definitely the way that you have to do that is we've had to become almost like a domestic outpost within a foreign policy ministry on labour issues. So we've had to really build our capability in workforce data, how the migration review works, how visas work. It was a real standing start for DFAT, but we've had to do it. We've done it over a number of years now. We've had to be very much at the front and centre of that domestic debate. And that's been really important, not just in setting it up, but also, and I'll get onto this, there's a question I think later in that talks about some of the challenges. One of the challenges that we always have is it's about future migration settings. So in many ways, what we've done with the Pacific is we've created preferential access for the Pacific, and that is partly because there is market failure in the sense that Australia's migration policy at the moment is very much targeting skilled migration. Apart from working holiday makers, which, as I've mentioned before, was unsponsored and unskilled generally, these are the only real schemes that provide access for low and semi-skilled workers into Australia's migration system. So we've had to really build a case for that, and that has required, over many years, sort of government or cabinet level agreement to some of these schemes. We are intervening in many ways into a failed market, and what we hope to do over time is build the Pacific's capability and also the private sector's ability to be able to access Pacific workers into the future. It does rely quite a lot at the moment on government as opposed to private sector. As you're all aware, migration agents tend to play a pretty important role globally in this type of space. In the Pacific, that wasn't part of what was happening, and that's partly because we didn't really have this stream of low and semi-skilled visas on offer. And we've done it in a very regulated way. And one of the reasons we've done it in a highly regulated way is to really be mindful of our modern slavery and other sort of people smuggling types of risks that can come with a private sector driven approach without ensuring that you've got the right bells and whistles around it. So the first one was really, I guess, DFAT becoming much more integrated into the domestic debate on labour mobility and working hand in hand across domestic agencies. And we're very much now with the agriculture visa that we've been asked to run, very much at the centre of what would normally be done by domestic agencies. And that has happened really in many ways on the relative success of the Pacific Labour Scheme in terms of how it protects workers and provides a level of assurance around workers, which is really important to many stakeholders in Australia and also to government. Just getting on to Pacific Labour and how we implemented it, I think I've mentioned that DFAT has never run a labour program before. The seasonal workers program was run by our employment department. So although we had some knowledge of the seasonal workers program, particularly from our post, who played a role in implementing and really liaising on those issues, we had to really build the plane and fly it at the same time, which is pretty risky. We also had, because of the visibility of Pacific Labour, we had enormous pressure from government to scale up the Pacific Labour Scheme quickly. And of course, with any scale up, you have risks. We employed an outsourced model. So we basically tendered for a contractor to run the Pacific Labour Scheme. We call that the Pacific Labour Facility. Again, a lot of the contractors in this space had never run a labour mobility program before. The seasonal workers program was implemented by government as opposed to an outsourced model. So the role that DFAT played in this was very much in the policy space and that the relationship and the development aspects of Pacific Labour Scheme, whereas the day-to-day welfare, support to workers, intersection with the Australian private sector to build demand, we outsourced that through a managing contractor, and we very much had to manage that and make sure that we were adopting what we call a partnership model with that contractor. So we were working hand in hand, not just with them, but with industry, as well as, I guess, in many ways, the Pacific High Commissions and consular capability here in Australia also played a really, really important role in kind of over time ironing out some of the implementation kinks. So we've really encouraged Pacific countries who on the whole don't have a well-developed kind of labour attaché kind of consular capability, because they weren't traditionally in many of the countries, not all, they weren't traditionally playing that role for their overseas workers. So that's been a really important part of it as well, is kind of bringing everybody with us and coming to a common understanding about how we protect workers here in Australia. One of the challenges that we've really had is in getting the right risk appetite. When you start off a program, we did have in many ways a pretty high service offer, both to employers, because we're really trying to get them into the scheme. And we did a lot of hand holding through the Pacific Labour Facility on that, but also on welfare. So we were providing quite a lot of welfare support, and it wasn't really about critical incidents. It was really about settling into Australia, how to open bank accounts. We were meeting everybody at the airport. So it was very hands-on, but we knew that over time we weren't going to be able to, as we scaled up, meet that level of serviceability. So over time, what we've really done is build in much more of a risk escalation framework. So and we've tried to pass a lot more to employers over time for some of those responsibilities, and then to kind of try and govern that through the deeds that we have with employers. So that's been something that we knew had to evolve, which has evolved. It will have to keep evolving further as the scheme gets bigger. The other thing that's been really important in this space is just to make sure that there is enough forums, I guess, for communication that brings together the various actors. So that includes many of our domestic agencies, our Australian Border Force, our Fair Work Ombudsman. It's also brought together peak bodies. So we have regular dialogue with the key peak bodies, particularly in agriculture, which is the biggest part of the scheme. We have dialogue with unions, and we're starting to build, as what we're actually doing at the moment is we're bringing the schemes together, because there has been duplication between the seasonal workers program and the Pacific Labour Scheme. So I've recently relaunched the programs as Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, the PALM scheme, and we're increasingly trying to bring them together so one employer for one program can be recognised from the other. And that's come out of consultations in terms of how we adapt these schemes to make them better for employers here in Australia so they're more attractive. So that's quite important with stakeholders here. We also have a really regular dialogue with our Pacific High Commissioners and ambassadors here in Australia to really go through, and we have working groups with them on particular issues that are important to them. So again, we're working hand in hand with Pacific and industry to try and solve problems as we go. Definitely the hardest area is really in that welfare space. We do get, traditionally we've had really, really low rates of what we call absconding. So that is people that leave the scheme and either sort of disappear into the ethos of Australia, somewhere into the Australian community, essentially becoming illegal, or that seek bridging visas, seeking asylum in Australia through a bridging visa. So there is very low rates of absconding, but during COVID it has increased. It's still low, but that there is risks of that. If people feel, normally what we find is that happens more if employees don't feel like they're being paid well or they're not being treated well. Sometimes it happens through middlemen, and we have a pretty high referral rate where we do find that there are middle people who are trying to essentially embark in sort of illegal practices to attract people off the scheme. So we're trying to really increase the information flows and communications to workers so they're not as vulnerable workers taken advantage of by unscrupulous actors in the sector. Thanks.
I mean, that is fantastic. I mean, thanks to you for that very insightful description of the way how you put life to a concept and implemented it. And it's a learning experience about the way how you defined the program, but also how you engaged with various stakeholders, whether in Australia, but also abroad, in order to make it happen and execute it. So that is a fantastic description of how you got it done. I have like so many questions, whether scripted or unscripted, but also I see that the time is ticking, and I would like to create some space for my colleagues at the Growth Lab, but also for the audience at large to post questions. But I'll ask very quickly two final questions, and then I'll invite the director of the Growth Lab, Professor Ricardo Hausmann, to pose some questions as well. So my two closing questions to you had to do more with how do you define success, and also what is the prognosis, right? So how do you see the future of these programs? And to just like briefly recap is that in the last 13 years, since 2008, you've experimented with 3 different programs, right? So you started the seasonal worker program in 2008, and it's still going at about 12,000 workers per year. You started the Pacific Labour Scheme in 2018, and a few weeks ago, you announced this new type of visa for agricultural workers, right? In particular, targeting workers from Southeast Asia. So from your position in the government, you've been so much involved with these programs. How do you define success of this type of policy reforms, right? So how do you evaluate the success of a program such as the PLS, for instance?
Okay, well, thank you.
And my last question will be more to get your thoughts on what is the outlook on Australian demand for labor mobility, and also what's the labor mobility strategy for the future?
Thank you for
Thank you.
that. So as I mentioned before, we've just basically recently announced that the merging of the two schemes to recognise each other's employers, and there will be continual reforms, and that's under the PALM scheme. Really important, just to set out before I get into the success, is that there's actually now 55,000 Pacific workers who are sitting in their, what they call labour setting pools, who have aspirations to come to Australia that have been pre-screened to come. So it's really important to highlight that aspiration is high, and what we're seeking to do is to really, the success will be defined in many ways about whether we can continue to scale up to meet some of that demand from the Pacific. So number one is that, which is continued scale up. So the Pacific Labour Scheme and other schemes that we have, the PALM scheme, become a source of employment for remittances, but also for learning and bringing skills back. So as I mentioned before, that isn't just about numbers. That is also about those people-to-people links, which are important for Australia in the region. And it's also about trying to get more into that semi-skilled space, and also trying to use it as a way of getting more workers to bring back investments to start up their own businesses from what they've learned here in Australia. We do have aspirations in that scale up as well, that we've got a larger cohort that have moved into those higher paying semi-skilled jobs. It's really important that some of the trials that we're doing, particularly in aged care, I think if we can get some of those trials going well, it will provide much more opportunity, which is my second point for women. At the moment, we do have pretty serious gender disparity, and that's very much driven by the sectors that we're working in. So meatworks and agriculture, traditionally male, but we play a really important role in pushing some of those employers to employ females and to change their own stereotypes about, what males and females do. And we have had success in like, for example, in a meatworks factory down in Victoria, in them taking 50% female and 50% male. And the feedback on female workers is really strong. So we do a lot of communications to really highlight some of those gender stereotypes which are coming from some of those traditional male-dominated sectors to get female. But more importantly, we really want to scale up, as I said before, the care and hospitality tourism sectors, because that is providing more opportunities for Pacific women, and that also provides a greater opportunity for women to play a greater role in decision making as well about how remittances and others get paid. We are looking as well over time, and there's definitely no policy on this, but these are some of the forward policy objectives that we're looking at, is how do we over time look at bringing families? What sort of access does that provide to education in a different kind of way to we traditionally do aid programs? So we are looking at those sectors and doing that research and that policy work more for the medium to long term from the short term, because it is an opportunity to also provide education at a larger scale, which is a really important part of our Pacific Step Up as well. So we are looking at those kind of future settings as well into the future. Third, success is also going to be built on, in many ways, the policy work that Australia does to keep Pacific as a preferential labour source for many of our industries. It is protected because of the schemes and because not many other countries are being offered the same opportunity. So in DFAT designing the ag visa, we have been asked to look at, to ensure that Pacific remains a priority source of labour because of our foreign policy objectives, but also because we're really conscious of designing the ag visa so it also has the same minimum standards for industry. Really important that it doesn't reduce the standards of welfare, assurance and compliance. It's a sponsored visa, as I mentioned before, so there will be an element of management of that to make sure that there's no race to the bottom. which we know we've seen in many countries, can also decrease labour standards. So in managing the ag visa, we're really conscious of making sure that we get our analysis of demand and supply of labour right. And it's very difficult to make many of those calculations in the ag sector, in part because illegal labour is also been an important part of the labour source traditionally in many countries, but also in Australia are many of the workers that have absconded, overstayed tourist visas are working in that sector. So a lot of the reform that needs to happen in Australia by the sector linked to consumer practices and modern slavery obligations that employers in Australia and industry sign on to. So the more we can kind of build up what we do with industry at the same time will always be really important to a success. So going forward, I think we want really strong ownership from industry in Australia of the schemes. We want to make sure that they've got an opportunity to, I guess, co-design it as we go forward. And that's very much what some of our stakeholder groups are designed to do, but also ensure that we keep labour standards high and that we keep the assurance high in the schemes, because that's really going to be important to Pacific countries over time, as well as Southeast Asia as they start to enter some of these schemes. Finally, I think you asked about sort of future outlook and demand. So as I mentioned before, immigration settings, highly political in every country. It's a major source of parliamentary and MP interest and committees. They're pretty much sort of regularly the main committee that happens across the political spectrum is on many of these issues. So our immigration settings are going to be really important. And I think, as everybody is aware, the pandemic has really, really changed the structure of the labour market with the exit of working holiday makers. We also, the reason that the ag visa came into its birth recently was actually on the back of the UK FTA that Australia was negotiating, where the UK actually asked that their working holiday makers no longer be linked to agriculture. So that basically provided an opportunity to create the ag visa. It was very political. I think many of you that watch it, and this has been in the media, so I'm not telling you anything that's not already in the media. It was talked about as a deal that was done between the coalition partners as well. The National Party in Australia has been asking for an agriculture visa for a long time. So just to kind of let you know that politics is very important to sort of what future immigration settings look like. So that's number one, is just really navigating that sort of post-pandemic politics of immigration settings. Number two, and that will very much depend on demand and supply as well. Number two is really, as I said before, really committed to making sure that we've got minimum standards. And our Fair Work Ombudsman, for example, has recently done studies, and it's basically finding that 6% of workers, even though foreign workers are 6% of workers, they actually make up 20% of formal disputes. And I think you're all aware that many cases don't actually get into the formal processes. So we have really strong referral, and also our program has dedicated funding that goes to the Fair Work Ombudsman to ensure that all cases of pay wage dispute are referred on and investigated. So I think that's really important as well, is just ensuring that the resources that go to domestic agencies for compliance and investigation and enforcement are actually resourced. If you don't have that, then that's really, really difficult to maintain those minimum standards by default from a program perspective. And then the third issue that's obviously going to have a really important impact on the future demand and the future pathway for Pacific labour mobility is actually technology. So, you know, for example, wines are now picked by machines. We understand that in 5 years' time, avocados will only need 20% of the labour force. In the care sector, very different story. With Australia's ageing population, there will be 1 million more jobs by 2050. So the way that we're designing and training needs to be very linked to the structure of our future labour market. And that very much is leaning in that direction of, we are going to need workers that are more highly skilled with certain qualifications to meet those demands. Thank you very much. Happy to answer other questions.
Daniel, thanks so much to you for your time and for the way you explained to us how did you conceptualize, design, implement, and how you're thinking of the next steps about labor mobility. At this point, I would like to invite the director of the Growth Lab, Professor Ricardo Hausmann, to ask some questions. Ricardo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and great to meet you, Danielle. Seen from our point of view, you are already in tomorrow, so I guess you might be, ahead of us for good reason, and maybe, exploring the future. Let me ask you. I have two questions, and I'll pose them at the same time, as that way you can decide how to mix it. One is you have a fairly open immigration policy, and I checked that you have something like 27% of your population is foreign-born or thereabouts. So there's a formal, say, long-term immigration policy, and then you have this temporary work, and presumably many people who come in temporarily may wish to stay, but the whole political agreement is in some sense predicated on the temporary nature of the scheme. So I wanted you to reflect upon, how does this, in some sense, enhance immigration by adding to long-term immigration a temporary component, that there would be no political agreement for these additional schemes, except because you are sort of making the commitment that these additional immigrants are going to be temporary. Let me maybe pose the question separately. So I'll ask my second question later. So is it, what's this? Reflect upon this tension between your permanent long-term immigration policy and these temporary schemes.
Sure. So good question. As I mentioned before, Australia's migration policy is very much being set on high-skilled labour. So we have every year our Home Affairs Department, which is responsible for immigration, who we work with very closely, but of course we're not part of. They will look at where the employment gaps are in Australia, and we have basically it's called the temporary skills shortage, and that will basically allow people to come to Australia to fill the skills gap. So I think there's something like 165 professions that are all essentially skilled in most cases. They are able to come to Australia with a permanent migration pathway. It costs a lot for those visas, so it might be something around 10 to 11,000. And part of what those schemes do is also it has a bit of a levy that then pays into, I guess, retraining Australians. So there's that kind of political element in terms of how the visa is designed. So it's bringing in long-term skilled migration. That's very much been at the forefront of Australia's immigration policy for a while, is to bring in skilled. We haven't had a policy up until really these temporary schemes that have brought in migration for low and semi-skilled. They haven't been traditionally areas that we've been wanting to bring people into. And one of the reasons for that is given that you have quite fast technology change in this sector, there has been the policy hasn't been to bring in people that might become welfare problems in the future if they haven't, I guess, got ongoing employment prospects, if those industries start to become mechanicalized over time. So that's very much driven the differences between some of our sort of longer term pathways to permanent migration and some of our temporary visa schemes like the seasonal worker program, working holiday makers, which fill kind of dual objectives. They provide opportunities for people to come to Australia as backpackers, have a fun time, work on the side, but they've never been sort of designed as long-term kind of employment programs. I guess what's changed a little bit with the pandemic and the ag visa that's been announced recently is that there is a recognition that in rural Australia and in many of these sectors, Australians are just not moving to do those jobs. And there's a variety of reasons for those. Meatworks is a classic one. Australians are just typically not attracted to be working in those sectors. So there is a kind of increasing understanding that some of our temporary schemes do need to be linked to some kind of permanent pathway, but it's not an automatic pathway. It's very much a moving through the steps process. So you actually are taking the people that are upskilling themselves into those sectors rather than an automatic pathway. If you come in on the ag visa, that does not mean that you're going to be able to definitely become a permanent resident in Australia. So it's very much about that sort of concern that if you bring in low-skilled migrants on a pathway, that those jobs will become redundant over time, and not wanting to create, I guess, a welfare dependency for groups that might become unemployed into the future. So it's really about those education pathways being linked. So you are developing that scheme. What also happens is typically people that are coming to Australia might start off in a rural area where there's job shortages, but over time, because diasporas are in cities, move to cities and no longer continue to work in those sectors. So a lot of the temporary schemes are linked, and some of our permanent migration schemes are also linked to staying with that employer in particular geographic locations as well. So those geographical indicators where there are sort of excess demand are really important to the visa settings as well that come around some of the temporary schemes.
That's very interesting. We've done some work on Gulf countries that also have very large temporary workers, and one of the implications that we've been puzzled about is the fact that as people work, they acquire experience, and with experience they become more productive. But then it's been the 2 years or the 3 years and they're out. So in some sense, the country never exploits these accumulated skills. And since a visa is employer-based, you don't get spillovers from one firm to another firm, because the person acquired that skill, and that skill does not become available to other people in the country. So they've been relaxing some of their rules to make lateral movements more easier.
Yeah. So one thing that's been important with the seasonal worker program, because it is seasonal, workers do return. So a lot of employers have had the same employees now on a seasonal basis for like a decade, and what will happen is they tend to use those workers to recruit others. So they are getting that repeat skills gain and those productivity gains because they are using the same workers coming back. What there isn't at the moment, of course, is a permanent pathway for that cohort. There is actually you can in certain professions, and this is growing now with the pandemic, there are some industry awards that we have and geographical sort of immigration settings that do allow employers to sponsor employees to stay and to take on that permanent pathway. So there are sort of opt-in arrangements for people that move up the food chain that can kind of qualify for those kinds of schemes that are available. But yeah, it's an important point on that productivity gain that people want from workers.
Let me just ask a final question. I know that Ermal wants to close because you're past our bedtime, but if Australia looks a little bit like the US. It has the East Coast, and then you have Sydney, Melbourne, Canberra, etc. And then it has the West Coast. The West Coast should be like California, right? And California has 40 million people, and Perth has less than 2. I mean, if there was more autonomy for having their own immigration policy, and if you could have something in between where people could be allowed to migrate into parts of Australia, or is Perth and Western Australia being punished by the limits imposed by Eastern Australia?
So, good question. There are actually, so South Australia actually has migration there, which the Immigration Department designated area migration agreements. And what they are is they basically allow easier access for migrants to come into those areas, for any industry that's got a skill shortage in those areas to come in. So South Australia, as an example of a state, has one that pretty much covers the whole state because of their skill shortage in certain sectors. So it does allow those kind of, I guess, labour disparities across Australia are taken account of from some of these DARMAs, but also a lot of our permanent migration, or permanent pathway migration, sort of higher skilled labour, they are linked to postcodes as well. So if you're coming into Australia for a job, some of the things that you will require to go into a regional area are actually lower bars than what you might need to go into an urban setting. And we have a sort of traditionally a points system for immigration. So if you're going into a regional job in a regional area sponsored by an employer, it's actually easier for people to get access to those kinds of schemes. So yes, it is adjusted for some of those challenges that some states and territories have, but it's more about regional versus urban rather than necessarily states. Is probably the general taking for that. So yeah, that's really important point. We do have really different labour market disparities, and in our schemes we're at certain areas a lot more. Queensland actually has the highest number of workers at the moment under these schemes. And that's partly because of the sectors that we work in, but just generally on migration, I don't have, because I'm not from the immigration department, I'm just having to learn a lot of this as we fly the train. The immigration is what will often happen is people will stay in, their employment is linked to being in that location for the time of their sponsorship, but then once they become a permanent resident, they're then free to move. So you actually are linked in many ways for 3 to 5 years. Over. Emil, did you want to come in?
No more questions from me. I think we are past the allotted hour, so I would like to thank you so much, Daniel, for being with us today. I would like to thank very much Professor Ricardo Hausmann for his questions and the participants to this talk. We'll be very happy to connect with you, Daniel, again, and continue this fascinating discussion. As I mentioned earlier, the more you spoke, the more questions I had at the tip of my tongue. But I'll restrain myself and I'll post them in another event, but also offline. So thanks so much again. Thank you to all, and I wish everyone a fantastic day ahead.
Thanks, everyone.